Good afternoon. This hearing will now come to order. Welcome to today's hearing entitled The Science of Security, Part 2, Technical Problems Continue to Hinder Advanced Radiation Monitors. Soon after the September 11 attacks, Customs and Border Protection, CBP, began operating radiation portal monitors to screen cargo entering the United States for radiological and nuclear material. They have purchased approximately 1,500 polyvinyl toluene monitors and deployed them at ports and border crossings throughout the United States. Mercifully, polyvinyl toluene monitors are generally referred to as PVTs. PVTs indicate the presence of a radiation source, but they cannot identify the nature of the source. As a result, any cargo container that provokes a warning from a PVT is then sent to a secondary inspection where customs officers use other technology and information to determine what sort of materials is in what sort of material is in the container. There are plenty of innocent sources of radiation: kitty litter, medical isotopes, ceramics, bananas, and many of those secondary inspections can be handled quickly. However, some secondary inspections require that the container be opened and even emptied in the search for a source. That is time-consuming, but the PVT seems to be working well to meet Customs' dual mission to keep us safe while maintaining a steady flow of commerce. The Department of Homeland Security has been developing a new radiation portal monitor championed by the Domestic Nuclear Detection Office, DNDO, that advocates believe should replace the PVTs. The new monitor, the Advanced Spectroscopic Portal Monitor, or ASP, would detect the presence of radiation in cargo, but it would also identify the type of radiation. That would allow more harmless cargo to pass unimpeded through the port and require far fewer secondary referrals. If it worked as advertised, the ASPs would be more likely to identify highly enriched uranium or other materials of concern and enhance the flow of commerce while freeing up customs officers to tend to other duties besides secondary inspections. Despite a $230 million investment of taxpayer dollars thus far for development, the ASPs haven't performed as expected, and the results from recent tests are still worrisome. Last June, we learned of problems in the first field test in February 2009. At our June hearing, we heard those issues had been fixed, and that the July field test would allow the department to move forward toward a cost-benefit analysis and certification decision for the Secretary. So far, we have seen neither. The July test highlighted yet another problem with the ASPs. The devices detected nuclear materials when none were present. The ASPs had numerous false positive hits for special nuclear materials in July, each one of which have resulted in the implementation of mandated security responses by Customs, potentially shutting down port operations. Fortunately, Customs was also running PVTs, which saw no radiation presence, and there was none, and cleared up the issue in secondary fairly quickly. DNDO has told our staff that they intend to fix this new problem by changing the sensitivity of the ASPs to detect uranium, but it isn't clear why that should be reassuring, changing the sensitivity setting. If we lower the sensitivity setting to the very materials the ASP is supposed to be better at monitoring or at detecting, why would the ASP would it still be better? The ASP still be better than PVTs at detecting those materials? And would we have to go back to the Nevada test site to prove that you can still detect levels of special nuclear material more accurately than the PVTs can? Second, if the materials detect special nuclear material when there is none there, how does changing the sensitivity make any difference at all? Detecting ghost isotopes is a problem with the operating system, not with the sensitivity level. It would appear anyway. Since the taxpayers have spent $200,000 for each of the 1,500 PVTs that are deployed now, the case for the ASPs, which will run about $800,000 per unit, a total cost of $2 to $3 billion, needs to be clear both in terms of better detection performance and better support for customs operations. Add to that greater acquisition cost, an annual operating expense of ASPs that is at least 5 times more expensive per unit than PBTs, and the need for a convincing case is even greater. As it stands, it is hard to see why ASPs should be more than a secondary inspection tool. In fact, that is the role they play in the Department of Energy's megaport program. The DOE already runs a program that inspects cargo leaving 27 major foreign ports for destinations anywhere in the world. DOE, which developed the portal radiation detection technology, uses PBTs for primary inspection and then uses the ASPs for the secondary inspection to help identify the kind of isotope to which the PBT responded in the first place. The Department of Energy's approach to identifying radiation should be instructive to DHS. I want to thank all of our witnesses for appearing today. I particularly want to thank the GAO for continuing their work on this matter and for their continued assistance to this committee and to Congress. The Appropriations Committee as well. It is very helpful for the Appropriations Committee to be asking the right questions, and you have helped them and helped us ask the right questions. I suspect that this will not be the last time that we gather on this subject. We do seem to come back to the same subjects again and again, nor will it be the last time we hear from witnesses that we still face a long list of tests and validations before we can think about replacing the PBTs with the ASPs. And I would now recognize the ranking member, Dr. Brown, for his opening comment.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I want to welcome the witnesses here today and thank y'all for participating in our follow-up hearing on the Department of Homeland Security's Advanced Spectroscopic Portal Program. It's hard for a Southerner to say quickly. This afternoon we'll be brought up to date on the Department's ongoing development of the next generation radiation portal monitors and get an update from the GAO on their continuing work. As I said in our earlier hearing this past summer, this program is certainly not out of the woods. The latest field validation test revealed additional problems that will have to be overcome before moving forward. I hope DNDO will be able to give us some insight today on what we can expect from this program in terms of the future paths forward. With considerable taxpayer money on the line, questionable improvements over current capabilities, an outstanding cost-benefit analysis, and a confusing acquisitions history that unfortunately has morphed the R&D with procurement, this program is rapidly approaching a point where the federal government has to decide whether it wants to fish or cut bait. I'm concerned with the fact that considerable public funding has been expended on developing a technology that the private sector was developing in parallel on its own dime. DHS as a whole and DNDO, CBP, DHS, S&T individually, should be focusing on long-term, high-risk, high-reward technology, not providing seed money for commercial off-the-shelf equipment. That being said, I realize that DHS's mission is vastly different from DOE's and the Department of Defense's, and that they have additional requirements that demand a more robust system. GAO and the Academy made several recommendations over the past few years. I trust that DNDO and CBP will be able to update this committee on how they are responding to those recommendations and where they plan to go from here. The nation expects a lot from the department, and I hope that we aren't developing tunnel vision by focusing too much on one method of conveyance and not seeing the forest for the trees. The department has an enormous task of securing our borders, and not just at points of entry, but all along our borders. Spending billions of dollars to secure the front door of our house doesn't seem very rational if we're just going to leave the back door open and all the windows and have a gaping hole in the walls too. That is not to say that we should do nothing at all, but rather everything we do should be put in context of a well thought out global nuclear detection architecture. As I said earlier this summer, many of the issues we are dealing with today could have been prevented by engaging the end users earlier in the process. clearly defining the requirements, developing clear architectural priorities, and simply following a clear acquisition process. This committee is no stranger to programs that have set aside these best practices for working in expediency's sake. I look forward to working with the department and the majority to make sure any decision that is made is in the best interest of our nation's security, the taxpayer, and our economy. With that, Mr. Chairman, I yield back my time, and thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Brown. I ask unanimous consent that all additional opening statements submitted by members be included in the record without objection. It is so ordered. There's been an email exchange between our staff and the staff of DNDO, Kimberly Koppel, and without objection, I move that these the printed version of emailed questions and answers also be entered in the record. Without objection, so ordered. It is now my pleasure to introduce our witnesses at this time. Mr. Gene Aloise is the Director of Natural Resources and Environment at the Government Accountability Office, GAO. He is an expert in international nuclear proliferation and safety issues and holds degrees in political science, economics, and public administration. Mr. Aloise is a recipient of GAO's Meritorious Service and Distinguished Services Awards and has served several congressional committees and offices within GAO. This is not the first time he's appeared before us on this topic. With Mr. Aloise is Dr. Timothy Parsons, GAO's chief scientist. Before joining GAO, Dr. Parsons was the technical director of the Intelligence Advanced Research Projects Activity, IARPA, and previously served as a technical director at the National Security Agency. Mr. Parsons, if people ask you at a cocktail party what you did for a living, did you just say you worked for the government? Okay. He holds degrees in nuclear physics, computer science, and biomedical engineering, and has been involved in evaluations of many high-tech U.S. government programs and projects, including GAO's work on the Advanced Spectroscopic Portals, ASP, monitors. We look forward to hearing his testimony today as well. Mr. Todd C. Owen is the Acting Deputy Assistant Commissioner of the Office of Field Operations for the U.S. Customs and Border Protection, Department of Homeland Security, also a mouthful. He also served as the Executive Director of the Cargo and Conveyance Security Office of Field Operations since May of 2006. Mr. Owens began his career with the Customs and Border Patrol in 1990 and has previously held the positions of Area Port Director in New Orleans and Director of the Customs Trade Partnership Against Terrorism, CTPAT program. And then finally, Dr. William Hagan is the Acting Deputy Director of the Domestic Nuclear Detection Office at the Department of Homeland Security. Dr. Hagan holds degrees in physics and nuclear engineering, as well as 3 patents. He spent 30 years with the Science Applications International Corporation before coming to DNDO and serving as the Assistant Director of the Transformational Research and Development Directorate. I think all of our witnesses would need to use small print for their business cards. As our witnesses should know, you will each have 5 minutes for your spoken testimony. Your written testimony will be included in the record for the hearing. When you all have completed your spoken testimony, we will begin with questions. Each member will have 5 minutes to question the panel. It is the practice of this subcommittee to receive testimony under oath. This is an Investigations and Oversight Subcommittee. Do any of you have any objection to taking an oath? Let the record reflect that none of the witnesses had any objection. You also have the right to be represented by counsel. Do any of you have counsel here? And let the record reflect that all the witnesses said no. We asked you these questions to put you at ease. If you'll now all please stand and raise your right hand.
And we're not going to waterboard it.
Well, that would be the next hearing. Please stand and raise your right hand. Do you swear to tell the truth and nothing but the truth? Okay. Let the record reflect that Each of the witnesses did take the oath. We will begin with Mr. Gene Aloise. Mr. Aloise, please begin.
Mr. Chairman, members of the subcommittee, I am pleased to be here today to discuss DHS plans to develop and test advanced portal monitors, known as ASPs, for use at the nation's borders to prevent nuclear materials from being smuggled into the United States. My testimony today focuses on the results of DNDO's testing of the ASPs, including the July 2009 field testing. According to DHS, the current system of radiation detection equipment, the PVTs, is effective and does not impede the flow of commerce. However, DHS wants to improve the capabilities of the existing equipment with ASPs. One of the major drawbacks of the ASP, as you know, is a substantially higher cost compared to the existing equipment. We estimated that the life cycle cost of each standard cargo version of the ASP to be about $822,000 compared to about $308,000 for the PVT standard cargo portal, and that the total program cost would be about $2 billion. Earlier this year, I testified before the subcommittee on DNDO's 2008 round of ASP performance testing at the Nevada test site. That testing showed that the ASPs performed better than the PVTs in detecting certain nuclear materials and met DOE's threat guidance. However, the ASP's performance rapidly deteriorated once shielding was slightly increased. These test results showed what we reported in 2006, that any increase in detection of certain nuclear materials would be marginal. While the ASP may have met DOE's threat guidance for shielded nuclear material, the threat guidance is not a realistic approximation of how a terrorist might shield nuclear material to successfully smuggle it undetected across our borders. The latest round of field testing conducted in July revealed two critical performance problems with the ASPs that the chairman mentioned. First, the ASPs had an unacceptable high number of false positives for the detection of high-risk nuclear material. In other words, the ASP was seeing nuclear material that wasn't there and alarming. CBP officials told us that any alarm for this type of nuclear material is very disruptive to a port or border crossing and could effectively shut down operations until the source of the alarm is found. Furthermore, repeated false alarms for nuclear materials could have the undesired effect of causing CBP officers to doubt the reliability of the ASPs and be skeptical about the credibility of future alarms. The second critical failure of the ASPs noted in the July testing stemmed from a problem with a key component of the equipment, which led to an ASP to, in essence, shut down. Of great concern was the fact that the ASP did not alert the CBP official that it had shut down and was not scanning cargo. If this were not a controlled test, the CBP officer would have allowed the cargo to enter the United States thinking it had been scanned when it had not. DNDO's proposed solutions to these critical failures raise questions about whether the ASPs will provide any meaningful increase in the ability to detect certain nuclear materials. Specifically, to address the problem of false positives, DNDO is modifying the ASP to make it less sensitive to certain nuclear materials. While this may fix the problem of false alarms, it diminishes even further the ASP's ability to detect the nuclear material we are most concerned about. To address the second failure, DNDO plans to, among other things, install an indicator light on the ASP that will alert CBP officials that the ASP has a mission-critical failure. In our view, an indicator light is not the solution. The ASP must be stable and secure enough to avoid these shutdowns. Furthermore, DNDO has not completed efforts to improve the PVTs to detect high-risk material through energy windowing. CBP has repeatedly urged the completion of this research because an improved PVT could be the more cost-effective way to improve detecting certain nuclear materials and have a similar performance to a working ASP. In closing, the concerns raised by the results of the July 2009 field testing provide even greater reason for DNDO to implement our recommendations from our May 2009 report. In particular, our recommendation that DNDO assess whether the ASPs meet the criteria for significant operational effectiveness based on a valid comparison with the PVT's full performance. This is especially relevant given that ASPs seemingly will no longer be as effective in detecting certain nuclear materials. Mr. Chairman, that concludes my remarks. Dr. Persons and I would be happy to respond to any questions you may have.
Thank you, Mr. Aloise. Dr. Persons? I think I said Parsons earlier. Persons.
No
All
worries.
right, but you're okay. You're here to answer questions, but
Yes,
the testimony of Mr. Aloise is your testimony as well.
That is correct.
Okay, Mr. Owen.
Chairman Miller, Ranking Member Braun, distinguished members of the subcommittee, I'm honored to be here this afternoon to provide an update on the role that U.S. Customs and Border Protection plays in protecting our nation from the illicit introduction of radiological or nuclear materials in cargo containers, and on the future role that advanced spectroscopic portal technology would have on CBP operations. I would like to begin by expressing my gratitude to Congress for its continued support toward CBP initiatives. Among the numerous priorities that were recognized in the American Recovery and Reinvestment Act of 2009, Congress provided CBP with $100 million in stimulus funding towards upgrading and adding non-intrusive inspection equipment. This funding will allow CBP to upgrade and expand its successful NII program and more effectively inspect containers and vehicles crossing our border, allowing them to enter our country and its commerce in a safe and prompt manner. Every day, over 57,000 maritime containers, truck trailers, and rail cars cross our border. CBP uses a multi-layered approach to ensure the integrity of supply chains from points of stuffing through arrival at U.S. ports of entry. This multi-layered defense is built upon interrelated initiatives, which include the 24-hour rule in the Trade Act of 2002, the automated targeting system, non-intrusive inspection equipment and radiation portal monitors, the Container Security Initiative, and the Customs Trade Partnership Against Terrorism CTPAT program. These complementary layers enhance security and protect our nation. Prior to 9/11, not a single radiation portal monitor and only 64 large-scale NII systems were deployed to our nation's borders. By October of 2002, CBP had deployed the first RPM to the Ambassador Bridge in Detroit, and today CBP has just under 1,400 RPMs and 232 large-scale NII systems deployed nationwide, and that's an increase of almost 200 more RPMs and 5 additional large-scale NII systems since I last testified before the subcommittee in June. NII technology allows the officers to detect possible anomalies which may indicate the presence of weapons of mass effect or some other contraband. In FY 2009, CBP conducted over 5.2 million examinations using NII technology, allowing CBP to meet our twin goals of enhanced security and trade facilitation. In addition to the significant strides made in the area of NII equipment, CBP also continues to deploy first-generation radiation portal monitors to our nation's ports of entry. Since last testifying before the subcommittee, CBP and DNDO have now completed deployments of RPMs along the northern border and now scan 100% of trucks and passenger vehicles arriving from Canada, 100% arriving from Mexico, and 98% of arriving sea containers for the presence of nuclear or radiological materials. Since the first RPM was deployed in 2002, CBP officers have scanned over 404 million conveyances for the presence of radiation, and 2.2 million radiological alarms have been successfully adjudicated with minimal or no impact on the flow of legitimate trade and travel. CBP continues to closely coordinate with key stakeholders to ensure the impact of this activity causes minimal disruption on port operations. The first-generation RPM systems, although very sensitive, do have limitations. While they alert the CBP officers to the presence of radiation, a secondary exam is necessary to positively identify the specific isotope causing the alert. In the event that a CBP officer is unable to positively resolve the alarm, scientific reachback is available 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. The ASP is expected to enhance our detection capability while significantly reducing the number of secondary examinations. This is due to its ability to distinguish between actual threats and natural or medical radiation sources that are not security threats. CBP has worked closely with the DNDO in the development and operational testing of ASP, has provided DNDO with functional requirements, and has been actively engaged in every step of systems evaluation. CBP will continue to work with DNDO and with the DHS Science and Technology Directorate, S&T, towards secretarial certification, and is also working with DHS to ensure that any future acquisition and deployment decisions are consistent with DHS priorities. The decision to purchase and deploy ASPs in the operational arena will be based on CBP's mission needs and operational requirements, a comprehensive cost-benefit analysis to include a full understanding of the maintenance and operational costs, and analysis of alternatives and other considerations. Mr. Chairman, members of the subcommittee, today I have addressed CBP's commitment to investing in new and emerging detection technology aimed at enhancing cargo security. We must continue to maintain our tactical edge by integrating new technology into our ports of entry. Thank you again for the opportunity to testify. I'd be happy to answer any questions.
Thank you, Mr. Owen. Dr. Hagan for 5 minutes.
I'm sorry, I'm losing my voice. Good afternoon, Chairman Miller, Ranking Member Brown, and the distinguished members of the subcommittee. As Acting Deputy Director of the Domestic Nuclear Detection Office, DNDO, at the Department of Homeland Security, I'm honored to be here with the U.S. Customs and Border Protection Executive Director for Cargo and Conveyance Security, Mr. Todd Owen. I would like to thank the committee for the opportunity to provide this update on our Advanced Spectroscopic Portal Program, or ASP. Since our last hearing, ASP systems have undergone another round of field validation conducted by CBP. The purpose of field validation is to produce information about the operational characteristics of the system and correcting the issues that must be resolved before moving on to the next test, the last test event for the system, the operational test and evaluation. The July field validation identified several issues. We worked with CBP to classify the severity of these operational and technical issues, and DNDO has since addressed all of the issues initially identified. Because of the systems are configuration controlled, adjustments were checked and validated through use of a replay tool and regression testing to ensure that sensitivity to threats was not decreased below guidance. Although a few issues remain to be resolved, we are optimistic that field validation can be restarted in the near future. After CBP completes field validation, OT&E will be conducted by the DHS Science and Technology Directorate's Operational Testing Authority. The current path to certification includes field validation and OT&E, as well as preparation of all the departmental acquisition program requirements, including presentation of the program before the DHS Acquisition Review Board, or ARB, for a production decision. We are committed to following the Department's Management Directive 102-01. As such, we cannot speculate about the outcome of the ARB decision. The Secretary's decision regarding certification will follow the ARB. Beyond testing of the ASP systems, deployment of our current low-rate initial production ASP units is now being considered. The FY 2010 Appropriations Bill, signed 3 weeks ago, contains specific language encouraging incremental deployments of ASP, as did the report from the National Academy of Sciences, and we are planning discussions with CBP regarding the best way to deploy these units once OT&E is completed. However, one new obstacle has emerged that will greatly impact the path forward. The United States is facing a severe helium-3 shortage. Helium-3 is a gas that is used for neutron detection within both current and next-generation RPMs. Because this decreased supply affects multiple agencies within the federal government and beyond, the White House has convened an interagency policy committee, including DHS, to discuss the issue and possible solutions. This group decided in September that no more helium-3 will be allocated to RPMs for the time being. We are currently leading interagency efforts to identify alternative neutron detectors, and we are working to assess the impact this will have on our deployment strategy and path forward. For now, we plan to continue field validation and operational test and evaluation and are exploring our options for the path forward beyond that. Additionally, I've also been asked to address the status of improvements to the currently deployed RPM systems, the PVT systems. Some have asked if software or algorithm improvements, including improvements to the energy windowing algorithms that are currently deployed, could provide enhanced capabilities for PVT systems. We are currently funding work at Pacific Northwest National Laboratory and the Johns Hopkins University Applied Physics Laboratory to improve energy windowing and conduct related research to determine what kinds of PVT improvements may be possible. This research is still ongoing. That being said, it is important to note that any improvements to PVT detectors will only improve primary inspection capabilities or detection. Current performance limitations in secondary inspection, where CBP officers require the ability to identify radiological sources, are not addressed by improvements to PVT technology. Better energy windowing algorithms will not change this fact. As a final note, I would like to emphasize that the ASP program is only one piece of the multi-layered solution we have termed the Global Nuclear Detection Architecture. This strategy calls for the use of multiple preventive actions at our ports, as well as security measures along all potential pathways beyond, at, and within the nation's borders. We will continue to work with our partners within DHS, other federal departments, state and local agencies, and the members of this subcommittee and the Congress to keep the nation safe from radiological and nuclear terrorism. This concludes my statement. I thank you for your attention and will do my best to answer any questions you may have.
Thank you, Dr. Hagan. I now recognize myself for 5 minutes. Mr. Owen, I hope that CBP's procedures, if you identify nuclear materials, the kind of nuclear material that would be used in a nuclear weapon or for a dirty bomb, that your procedures would require that you act like your hair was on fire, that you act with great urgency. Without getting into anything that's classified in this setting, could you describe what your procedures are?
Yes, sir. Whenever we have any alarm of a PVT on primary, the cargo or the passenger vehicle is then sent into secondary because, again, the PVTs at this point only detect radiation. They do not identify what it is. In the secondary, we use the handheld radiation isotope identification device. If that determination is that we have special nuclear materials, we then implement what we call SIN procedures: secure, isolate, notify. We secure the area, we isolate the conveyance, and then we begin our notifications back to our laboratory and scientific services folks at our National Targeting Center for Cargo here in Northern Virginia. The CBP officers would transmit the radiation spectra to the laboratory scientific services people to make a determination as to what we have there. So as this is going on, again, we are in secondary. It is a more controlled arena. Depending on the footprint of the port, depending on the layout, the time of day, the traffic will impact how much of a disruption it will be to some port operations. But clearly, whenever we have a higher level threat, such as the special nuclear materials, we do act accordingly. There is some disruption to the port operations until we resolve that alarm.
You said secure, identify, secure the area. How big an area do you secure?
Mostly it's just in the secondary area with what we have. We'll create a perimeter, a secure area, if you will. It will not require an automatic shutdown of neighboring activities or anything like that. As we do the initial readings, send it back to our laboratory and scientific services folks. Clearly, if the issue is escalated, if it is of grave concern to us, your exclusion zone would expand and the level of activity would increase.
Okay. Do you have any idea how many hours ports like New York, New Jersey, Los Angeles, Long Beach would be closed, or how they would be affected by false positives for special nuclear materials?
I don't have any data as to how many times this has happened or we shut down, but those are the procedures. And really, again, based on the layout of the port, if it is a large seaport, you could have just one terminal affected by an alert of special nuclear materials through one of our detection devices. If it's a smaller land border crossing, you could theoretically have a much greater impact on that type of operation. So there is an impact depending on the different variables as to how much of an impact, but clearly there is an impact whenever we have an alert of a special nuclear material.
Okay. Well, obviously one of the most immediate problem with false positives is disruption of commerce, disruption of ports and borders, but I remember from college that the first time the fire alarm went off in the dorm, everyone rolled right out of bed and went outside. But by the time it happened 3 or 4 times because of a prank, all anyone did was just put a pillow over their head to make the noise so they could sleep through the noise. I don't ever want it to become routine if we have an alert that there's a special nuclear material. Obviously, if there had been a real fire, the fire alarm would have done no good at all. Mr. Aloise, the July round of field validation tests, there were, you said, false positives. The machinery, the device, the ASPs, detected materials that were not there at all. Can you give us the details of how many false positives there were? Was it 1 or 2 machines? Was it all the machines? What happened?
Yeah, I believe, and CBP can confirm this, that it was 4 per 1,000 at the smaller ports and 8 per 1,000 at the 8 false positives per 1,000 conveyances at the larger ports during the testing in July.
And was that across all machines, or was that just 1 or 2 machines that seemed not to be quite right?
I believe it was across all machines, yes.
Okay, so there's a problem with technology, generally not with a problem with a specific...
With any one machine.
Okay. Okay, my time has almost expired, so I will recognize Dr. Brown for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Chairman. I still am going to be very very generous with time. If you've been very generous with me, and I will continue to be generous with you. If you, at any point, I want to make the chairman
After
aware.
serving for 2 years with Dana Rohrbacher as a member of the subcommittee, it's really not a problem.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. The recent round of the field validation testing revealed high levels of false positives for the special nuclear materials. This is a serious problem because any identification of special nuclear materials requires a robust response from CBP officers. What is DNDO doing to address this issue? And you might also, I'm concerned about not only false positives but false negatives, and and I really haven't heard anything about that. So if you could deal with that too.
Regarding what we're doing about the false positives, the field validation showed a large number, an unacceptably high number of calls for S&M. We have adjusted the threshold levels for the ASP and run a replay tool to demonstrate that, in fact, the number of false alarms, if these threshold settings had been used instead of what was used in July, that almost all of those false alarms would have been eliminated. The number would have dropped from about 40, according to my data here, from about 49 to 7. Now, no system is flawless or perfect, and so it's not likely that we will ever build a system that will produce no false alarms in primary. So, but the levels that we're operating now, according to the replay tool, are within the acceptability range. Regarding false negatives, in the flow of real commerce, in the field validation activity, there's really no way to know if you've dismissed something that you shouldn't have. So now we have testing in the at another place, in the Nevada test site, where we tested that, and I don't recall what the false negative rate was, but it was quite low.
As a physician, I'm concerned about, and in science, as you know, talk about specificity and sensitivity and all. But several independent sources have already indicated that ASP will only marginally increase our ability to detect lightly shielded special nuclear materials. If we manipulate those thresholds, won't this just decrease that margin even more? And if this is the case, how would that affect any future cost-benefit analysis?
The change in when the threshold settings were changed, again using the replay tool, we were able to calculate what the difference or see what the difference was in the sensitivity. It is a reduced sensitivity, as with any detector. When you make your system, when you make changes to reduce the false alarm rate, the sensitivity is usually affected. And so this is true of this detector as well. When but when we compare the sensitivity of the system before the threshold settings were made to that after, while it was reduced, the reduction was rather slight, and the performance of the system is still within the specification in the guidance.
In order to verify and validate the threshold changes made to the ASP systems, a reply tool was developed. Has this tool been validated by an independent party?
Yes, it has.
Okay, and who is that party?
The Johns Hopkins APL, Applied Physics Lab.
And what was their
Well,
what was the results of that?
okay. Well, maybe the best way to convey that is to comment or to give you some results from the replay tool validation exercise. So when we say a replay tool, we mean we want a tool that, when given the same input data as the real system, it produces the same results as the real system. And so the replay tool was given the real data for 11,000 occupancies, and the results were compared to what actually came out of the system. The results were identical for all 11,000 except for 8. Those 8 that were found that the reason that the differences were slightly different, or the results were slightly different, is that the codes were run on 2 different computers, and there was a slight round-off error difference between the 2 computers. And because of that, there were 8 occupancies that yielded slightly different results. But other than that, the results were identical. And,
Thank you. Mr. Aloise or Dr. Persons, do y'all have a response to that?
Well, we'd say this, and then I'll let Dr. Persons answer as well. As you recall, in June when we testified, we said there was a marginal improvement in the Nevada testing over what the PVTs were, and that marginal improvement, because of this reducing of the thresholds, has now gotten smaller. So when they do the cost-benefit analysis, all this has to be factored into that cost-benefit analysis, because now the ASP seemingly does not have the performance that it initially did when we testified here earlier this year. So that's one point. The other point is we have not looked at the replay tool. We have not talked to John Hopkins, so we can't really comment on the replay tool. Dr. Persons, would you like to?
Well, just to confirm what Mr. Aloise was saying, we have not been able to look at that. But one of our key points on this is just the idea of an independent verification or validation of such a tool to do that. And in interviews with CBP officials, for example, there was a concern about perhaps having an institution such as the American National Standards Institute or ANSI do something, a more standardized-oriented body to do that. There's also, of course, when you're dealing with software development issues which are implied in these systems with this level of complication, then you would look at, of course, the software models, the software standards, how those were constructed, how they execute the algorithms and perform under test. So,
Dr. Hagan, I'd like for you to, if you would, submit that report for the record for us, so and a good discussion about that. Okay, good. Thank you, sir. Mr. Chairman, are you back?
Thank you, Dr. Brown. The chair joins Dr. Brown in that request. Ms. Dowcamper for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you to all those here testifying today. I want to go to one of the most basic problems, and I guess one of the most alarming was the mission-critical failure when 24 cargo trucks were permitted to go through the ASP in order to be screened, and actually were not operating at that time. And supposedly this has been rectified by the contractor with a indicator light. Is that correct? No, nothing's been rectified.
It's been rectified, but not with an indicator light. There's a message that gets shown to the operator on screen that says that the system is in mission-critical failure and should not be operated.
Okay, so prior to this, there was nothing. There was no way to detect if it was.
There was a message, but it was confusing and not clear, and so that's what led to the incident. By the way, I should comment that this only happened one time in one system in all the testing and validation runs that have been going on for approximately a year. So we don't think it's going to happen again, but we've modified the software to properly notify the operator.
Because, I can buy a $15 smoke detector for my house, and it'll tell me when it's beginning to not work, and when it doesn't work, it'll beep, so I have to get up in the middle of the night and take the battery out. But anyway, I think that, I just want to make sure that problem is rectified at this point. And
It's been rectified, it's been regression tested, and we're confident that the message will be properly displayed. We are struggling a bit with this one error or issue that's come up because it's only happened once. So we don't think it'll happen again. But that's the point of field validation, is to shake out some of the issues and problems before you move on to the actual operational test.
how many of these are in operation in this field testing? How many?
6.
6. And how many of the PVTs do we have currently?
Just under 1,400 deployed nationwide at the land borders, seaports, and some mail facilities.
Okay. One of the things I want to ask Mr. Owen, the GAO's previous work on the ASPs, they found that the ASPs provide a, quote, marginal improvement over the ability of PVTs to detect the certain types of radioactive sources under only a handful of very specific scenarios. But the GAO has also recommended that DNDO invest in ways to increase the performance of the existing radiation monitors known as PVTs by a software improvement process called energy windowing. And do you believe that more efforts should be made to investigate the benefits of the energy windowing?
Yes, our position remains that we need to fully maximize what the detection capabilities of the existing technology of the PVTs is. So we believe there are gains that have already been made with energy windowing, and we would rely on our scientific partners to tell us if we have reached the edge of that envelope as to how much they can do, either with the existing algorithms or with advanced algorithms that may be there. So as the operator, the end user of the equipment, yes, we'd like to etch out as much detection capabilities as we can from the PVTs, recognizing that even with energy windowing, they will still not be an identification device, just a detection device.
Mr. Aloise, how much has been spent on energy windowing work by DNDO or DHS in the last few years compared to how much has been spent on developing ASPs?
I don't have that information, but I do know that we have been told that this further research has sort of been slow-balled, and we would have liked to seen them a lot further by now in where the energy windowing is with the PVTs.
Could I get that information? Could that information be found, Mr. Owen, in terms of how much work has been done?
Yeah, I can give you the numbers right now.
Okay.
Yeah, for energy windowing, we have funded a total of about $1.9 million. Again, to Pacific Northwest National Laboratory and the Johns Hopkins University Applied Physics Laboratory.
And how does that compare to how much has been spent on ASPs?
It's a lot less. I don't know the exact ratios or anything, but
What's the total? You don't know what the total has been spent on?
well, I think the number that was quoted, I wouldn't argue with. I think it was $230 million.
It's 1.9 million over the last how many years? Over
Which
last few years. When did we start? I'm new to Congress, so when did we start working on the ASPs?
ASPs 2004 or 5. I actually don't know. I wasn't here then.
So we've spent 230 million in that time period on that.
Right.
And the energy windowing, we started working on that.
That was in fiscal year 09. I think
Okay.
the actual work started in July of 09 at PNNL.
So since 09, since just this past July, we spent 1.9 million.
We haven't spent it. We've obligated it.
Obligated
I don't
it.
think it's been actually expended yet, but the work's ongoing.
Okay, and that just started this year.
Yes.
In July of 09.
July, right.
Okay, my time has expired. I yield back.
Thank you, Mr. Alkemper. Mr. Bilbray for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I apologize for being late, and so if my questions have already been answered, you can remind me that my tardiness was inappropriate. Mr. Owen, the issue of inspection, do we have a formal multi-tier inspection system? And when we talk about the inspection, is there any pre-entrance inspection before they get to the port facilities?
We do not pre-inspect cargo. What we do have as part of our layered cargo security strategy, we receive advanced information on all cargo in all modes before it arrives in the U.S., different timelines, whether it's coming by air, by truck, by rail, or maritime. With that advanced information, we make an initial assessment if the cargo poses a risk. In our maritime environment, through our container security initiative, we have officers deployed in 32 countries at 58 seaports that can then conduct an inspection on the highest risk maritime cargo before it's put on a vessel coming to the United States. We do not have a similar program in air or in land. So even though we have that advanced information before the truck or the train or the airplane arrives in the U.S., we can identify the highest risk, but then it would be looked at the port of arrival. So we do not have pre-inspection overseas for cargo.
Okay, so we do have it. We do have it for the maritime. We do not. Do we have any structure at all that if there was the ability to basically to modify the arrival system, in other words, hold them offshore until we could board the craft and be able to inspect it?
Yes, sir, absolutely. We work very closely with the Coast Guard. If there's any threats on a vessel, we will keep the vessel out at sea to address those threats or concerns with the crew or whatever the case may be. Likewise, with the air cargo, we receive the information 4 hours before the plane lands. So in most cases, if we have a concern, that aircraft can be diverted to have addressed that a threat. Yes, sir.
Yeah, and I'm glad to hear that, because let's face it, the port facilities tend to be much more centrally located in high population areas than either the port of entries with for vehicles or with the aircraft, and so that preemptive. The issue of helium-3, as we're fighting to try to make what we have stretch, any discussion of the crisis and what we would need to do to crank up the breeder so we can produce more and make it available for you?
I'll take that. There's been a lot of discussion. This issue has really risen quickly to the top of a lot of people's lists, including the White House. They have formed an interagency policy committee to address this that involves not only DHS, but of course the White House folks, as DOE, DOD, and so forth. The problem is rather severe. The demand will probably outstrip the supply by a factor of 10. There's just not very much, and there are other uses for this material, for helium-3 that involve medical uses and so forth that frankly will probably end up having higher priority, although I can't say that for sure.
So the fact is, this is a strategic supply problem that we need to address as a nation.
Yes, yes, I believe that's the case. Now, there are, so for some applications like low temperature physics research, helium-3 is pretty much the only, you're almost researching the material itself, so it can't be replaced. For our applications of neutron detection, there are other potential alternatives, which DNDO is taking the lead for the interagency group to explore. We've been funding research in this area for several years already. So we are looking at alternative means of detecting neutrons. But because we don't know what those means are today, there are several, as I say, potential alternatives, but it would still take a year or two probably to sort of test those, evaluate them, and make sure the designs work. So it's a real problem for us. That's why it's thrown a real glitch into our planning process.
Is there any other jurisdictions or agencies around the world that are specifically looking at developing this capability?
To make helium-3?
Yeah.
Well, there are places.
We don't have any others domestically. Is there anybody domestically looking at it?
Well, there's some thought to perhaps going into natural gas wells and separating some of the helium from that, and then distilling that, just pulling out the helium-3 from that. There's a possibility of a source in several sources in other countries. I probably shouldn't say much more than that.
Okay, Mr. Chairman, I know my time's expired, but in all fairness, there's a whole lot of issues that the federal government gets involved with that states, counties, cities, international bodies could work on or whatever. Here's one where this really is in our lap. I just can't perceive a state or a county or a coalition of states being able to address this issue. And here is one that I'd sure like to see the federal government make some priority decisions and say, this is one that only the federal government can do, so the federal government has to be more aggressive on this. And I will remind all of us as we talk about other issues that could be handled by other agencies that we keep forgetting about the ones that only we can handle, and maybe we need to focus on these items that other people can't handle. So I appreciate your testimony. Yield back, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you. Well, Mr. Rothman was here, and I think we'll be back shortly. I'll recognize him out of turn if he returns for a first round rather than for a second round. The chair of the Appropriations Subcommittee for Homeland Security is my colleague from North Carolina, David Price. His district adjoins mine. In fact, they kind of wrap around each other like a couple playing Twister. If he should ask me in what circumstances the new technology, the ASP, should be deployed, what should I tell him? What are the markers for when it is reliable enough to replace the PBTs? Should it never replace the PBT? Should it always be used unless there is some breakthrough that we haven't seen yet, some improvement in the technology? Should it always be used for secondary screening after a PBT is identified something to be concerned about? What are the, or is this worth it at all? If the PBTs seem to be working, there is some disruption of having a truck pull over to the side and going over it with by hand or cargo. But is this worth it? Mr. Aloise?
Well, our position has consistently been that nothing should be acquired in large scale until all the testing is complete, all the results are in, we know whether the system works or not. A cost-benefit analysis has been done, and we can see whether it is worth it, given all the other demands we have on our architecture, all the gaps in that architecture. After that cost-benefit analysis is done, we'll have a better answer to know whether it's worth to pursue with the ASPs versus the PBTs. Then the question is where? Does it make sense more in secondary? Does it make sense in other places? So our position, again, we need to get the testing done, all of it done. We need to do the cost-benefit analysis, and until then, we really don't have enough enough information to make this decision on.
Well, the original idea was to replace PBTs with the ASPs. Given what we know, even assuming that the testing improves, that we figure out what all the problems are, so that it doesn't sort of go off without it doesn't become non-functional without us noticing it for until after a lot of trucks have gone through, or it doesn't produce a amount of false positives that's going to shut down major ports for a significant period of time. After we've worked out those kinks, does it still make sense does it make sense at all for it to be a primary detection device instead of the PBTs?
We have our doubts.
Okay.
We have our doubts.
Mr. Owen?
Well, again, from our perspective, assuming it meets all of the technical and scientific endeavors and the machine's work, then we have a serious concern about the operation and maintenance costs, the tail that will come with each one of these devices. As you mentioned in your opening statements, we're looking at perhaps as much as 5 times or more what it costs to currently operate it. So we also are waiting anxiously to see the cost-benefit analysis as well as the life cycle costs to see if we can even, as an agency, afford these devices should they continue to develop and mature and be proven scientifically to work.
Okay. Dr. Hagan?
I agree with the GAO on this. Until we get the cost-benefit analysis and a lot of other data, by the way, that goes into what we call an acquisition review board, it's really not prudent to try to presuppose the result of that. We absolutely adhere to the notion that doing the testing and doing the validation, doing the cost-benefit analysis, the life cycle cost estimates, all that has to be done and fed into this process. And we have a very rigorous process within the department to do that. I wouldn't want to speculate about whether it's going to make sense in primary or secondary, either or both. But we at DNDO, at least, are indifferent to that. The point is it has to be driven by, real data and analysis.
3 years ago, Bale Oxford, who was then the director, I assume that's how you pronounce the name.
Yes.
Director of DNDO, said the priority for the first year is to get units out immediately. That seems like not the best idea right now. Does anyone disagree with that? Does anyone agree still with what Bale Oxford said then, 3 years ago? No, not a priority to get this in place immediately. Okay. When do we expect we will get the cost-benefit analysis?
The cost-benefit analysis is, we're actually struggling with this right now because of the helium-3 shortage and the impact of that. The cost-benefit analysis, of course, depends on what the cost of the system is. If we will have to most likely replace the helium-3 neutron detectors with some alternative. At this point, we don't know what that alternative is. As I said before, we have several potential candidates for that. But until we know what that is, it's going to be difficult to generate a cost-benefit analysis because we won't know what the cost of the systems is. It may be possible to work around that, but frankly, we don't know that yet. We're still looking at all the various options. We can try to get to a CBA, cost-benefit analysis. But without that information, and of course without the results from the operational test, we can't do that.
Okay. Dr. Persons, actually most of my questions I've directed initially to Mr. Aloise, and he used the first person plural, and then you nodded. So I didn't direct an additional question at you, but you have worked with many new technologies. Are there best practices? Are there lessons to be learned for how to develop new practices, how to develop and deploy new technologies, and have those lessons, have those best practices been applied with respect to this technology?
Yes, sir. I've worked with, coming out of an environment where familiar with the Defense Advanced Research Projects Agency. The idea about rapid technology development in the absence of requirements. That's normally for a very high-risk type, high-reward research and development paradigm. In this particular case, as you mentioned earlier, there's sort of some relatively mature technologies. It was just relatively immature, the concept of operations it was going to be asked to be placed under. In other words, a port operation with high volume and so on. And so I think some of the lessons learned from this was what you put your finger on just a moment ago was what I would call the mistake of scheduling invention. In other words, setting artificial deadlines. We want to get these out, and then we'll worry about sort of the technology development later on. GAO best practices for many years on this topic has shown that that's a mistake to do that. You want to risk mitigate the way you develop your programs by investing and particularly empowering your science and technology folks to do that, and do that outside of a procurement operation. Even though there needs to be close ties there, it still needs to be this idea that the science and tech folks can do the technology development and the procurement folks can worry about how to do the procurement. And so keeping that sort of balance of power, doing that, the requirements definition is hugely important. I think in this case the customer ultimately was CBP, and what were they going to be comfortable with in an operational paradigm? What was really was the CONOP really going to be a ASP and primary alone, a solo mode, or is it going to be a reduction in their manpower requirements and so on, or was it a special S&M detection paradigm alone? Those are some issues that drive requirements through CBP and ultimately into the program. And then thirdly, of course, the independent testing and evaluation. We've had a lot of discussion on that. And again, the key thing is there's the independence of that, how that is done. And so we have been pleased to see DNDO talking about interacting with DHS's OT&E office and so on at this phase.
Or one of the lessons learned that at some point you look for an off-ramp, that if a technology seemed like a good idea, right, but just didn't work, that you determined that it's not a matter of just working out kinks, but this was not as good an idea as it seemed. Are there measures for when you should look for an off-ramp?
Right. Well, GAO best practices recommend the use of readiness levels, technology readiness levels, and so on. I think one of the things here that could perhaps be used is the idea of software readiness levels and so on, because software and algorithms are such a critical part. I think that's manifested itself in the recent conclusion of the field validation tests and so on. So you have these metrics for doing that, and I think organizationally, as I believe DHS likely has, is some idea about what's an acceptable risk of this technology or this system for deployment. And there are ways to measure that and just give your managers informed decisions so that they can determine the risk of something, whether or not it needs to move forward into procurement mode.
What's that? How about I recognize you and you? Well, that's not quite a Daniel Rohrabacher 5 minutes, but I am over traditional 5 minutes. And with that, I'll yield to, recognize Dr. Brown for 5 minutes or more.
Thank you, Chairman. And I'm going to dovetail back into what the Chairman was asking. I'd like to know the metrics. It seems to me that we keep fooling around here and have excuses of not implementing a technology. And I don't want to leave a valid technology that's not only useful but maybe preferable over our current technology. But there are other things that CBP is already doing. And going back to the Chairman, when you're talking about an off-ramp, it seems to me we're getting to the point of fishing or cutting bait or one of the two. I mean, we've got to do something. And if y'all would give us some metrics about when we can expect the decision-making process, if you can help us to understand at what point do we need to pull the plug on the ASK program or implement something else or what have you with all of you, I would like to, because I don't have a good feeling about this, frankly. I don't know about other members, but I would appreciate it if y'all would give us some metrics, or if you have them, please tell me right now. Mr. Aloise?
Well, DHS came up with their significant increase in operational effectiveness as their metric for going forward with this new equipment. And we, from the beginning, thought it was a pretty low bar. I mean, I'll go back to what I said. Even this equipment, even if the ASP works, it's a marginal increase. And now with the adjustments in the thresholds, that margin has gotten more narrow. So what GAO's role here is to evaluate what DHS is doing and provide this information to the Congress, of course. And we've made recommendations all along to make improvements in the testing, in the reporting. But the bottom line, I have to go back to what I've said. Once the testing is done, we need to do that cost-benefit analysis and decide whether or not it's worth to go ahead with this. Now, it's taken longer. You mentioned in 2007 they were ready to deploy, but the Congress, through its oversight and getting GAO involved, has got us to where we are today. Now, where do we go from here? We go, it assumes, through a third round of field validation testing. The first round, they made adjustments. The second round, we may be seeing the results of those adjustments, and we don't know what's going to happen in the third round. The question is this equipment worth it? And that's a decision that DHS has to make. And, I mean, we've got a lot of information right now. Somebody can make a decision, or they can put this back into what we belong where it should have been for a long while, and that is in the R&D and development, and see what's the motion get out of this promising piece of equipment. But when we started down the path, or DHS started down the path of acquisition, deployment, and spiral development, they've called it, and it's got us to where we are today, where the equipment has a lot of problems. It doesn't work very well right now. And to take a risk and replace the equipment we've got now on the borders that we know works with equipment we don't know works, you're always going to have GAOs saying, whoa, step back. We need to look at this again. So I don't know, that's kind of a long-winded answer to your question, but we need more information before we could come to a conclusion, and that has to be the cost-benefit analysis.
Well, another question with the cost-benefit analysis, how can you do one without first knowing whether the ASP will be used as a primary screening tool or as a secondary screening tool? I think that needs to be determined, too, is in just doing that cost-benefit analysis, because otherwise you're just shooting in the dark. Frankly, I see the private sector developing screening methods without the taxpayer being on the hook for them. And we have this, we spent a bunch of money, and a lot of it sitting in a warehouse now and not being deployed, and we're testing. Mr. Chairman, I think it may be time to have that off-ramp from everything that I can see, but I don't know. And I'd just like to ask Mr. Owen, would you possibly agree with me that it's time to maybe look at other technologies.
Well, again, as you mentioned, the PVTs do meet our needs right now. They are effective. We can handle the level of alarms that we've got there. Well, hopefully with any advances through the energy windowing, they give us a little bit greater technology detection capabilities than we have right now. Whether we can say we should pull the plug or not, I think, again, from the CBP standpoint, the jury is still out. We need the cost-benefit analysis. We need to see how much better these, in fact, perform over the technology that we have before we could even make a decision as to should they just be in secondary or should they be in primary and secondary. But I just would like to just close by saying, again, through all of our testing, we've kept the PVTs up and running. So we've always had that safety net, that effective equipment that we know has worked, so that those 27 trucks did not get through when the machine went down.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Now you're back.
Thank you,
May I
Dr.
respond to any of this?
Yeah, yes, Dr. Hagan.
Thank you. First of all, I wanted to comment that the cost-benefit analysis addresses both primary and secondary screening. So we're not predetermining that outcome. Second, the ASP, what we've been talking about here primarily is about ASP and PVT in primary. And, you know, the debate will rage on. As I said before, I agree that the CBA is the way to determine that, you know, whether that's effective or not and worth the money. But the ASP operating in secondary is another matter. The limitations of the current system. CBP officers are using the current equipment as well as they possibly can. There's no question about that. But there are limitations to those systems in both primary and secondary. But let me focus primarily on let me focus on secondary. And in secondary, there are limitations which improvements to PVT cannot address. Only ASP can do that. I can't talk about the limitations or the changes or improvements of ASP compared to handhelds in an open session. But the differences are dramatic. And so I think this talk of an off-ramp would be very premature, and perhaps a closed session would be the way to deal with that. But I would urge you to consider the fact that ASP has considerable application and benefit in secondary.
Okay. It's not really my turn, but I do hold the gavel. Mr. Aloise, Dr. Persons, do you all have security clearances? Do you have the top secret security clearance, the top? Or are you familiar with all of the analysis of the comparative benefits of PVT and ASP and primary and secondary versus handheld? Are you familiar with all of that as part of the work you've done?
We're familiar with everything we've been shown, yes.
Okay. Have you asked for everything?
Well, yes, we have.
Okay. So if there's something you haven't been shown, you've asked for it and not been shown it.
Right, and we don't know that that's the case. But
Okay, right. And you do understand that GAO is part of Congress, and when they ask, we're asking, and we mean for you to give them anything they've asked for.
Absolutely.
Okay. Assuming that you've seen everything, is there anything, if we know all the top secret, all the tippy-top secret stuff, is it really different? Is the analysis a lot different in the way that Dr. Hagan suggests?
I would say this. I think you pretty much know the story.
Mm-hmm.
As it is, I have testified and GAO has reported on. Now, in regards to secondary, just in discussions among ourselves, you know, the ASP is bigger. In radiation detection, size matters. So it's a bigger instrument than the handheld. So just for that, you have longer dwell times in secondary. So there might be uses, there might be a possibility where it makes sense to put it in secondary, but we still don't have all that information.
Okay. What is the dwell time? I'm sorry.
You know, the container can sit a little bit longer in a secondary inspection, so you have a better count.
I see. Okay. You're not trying to move things through.
You're not driving through.
Okay.
Yeah. Right.
All right. I now recognize Ms. Dowkemper.
Kind of staying on this line of questioning, if it was used in the secondary manner, how many units would we need?
Yeah, I mean, I'm not, I don't have the data available as to how many secondary locations we have in all of the ports of entry, but it's far fewer than what we have in primary, obviously. But even with that, the volume through secondary is relatively low. I mean, we have about a 1% alarm rate on the land borders and about 2.6% apart in seaports. So we'd have to, again, look at the life cycle costs, the cost benefits as to how much better does it offset what it's costing us to buy this equipment versus the time savings or the fewer officers to address the secondaries.
Would anyone else like to address that? I don't know if anyone else can give me a different, more answer on that.
I can give you sort of a range. Like Mr. Owen, I don't have the numbers in front of me, but I believe the number of secondary sites is on the order of 400 to 500. Not clear that one would put an ASP at every one of those by any means, but and as Mr. Owen says, it's far fewer than the number of primary screening locations. So
I'm certain there would be certain points that would be much more crucial than maybe some of the borders. I mean, I live near the Canadian border. Some of those ports of entry are much more crucial than others.
Right.
I did want to ask, though, I want to kind of go back to this helium-3 issue, because I think this is a crucial issue even beyond this hearing today. Who's in charge of the interagency task force on this?
It's the White House. I can't remember the name of the the organization. I can give you the name of the person. That's about all I could do.
Who is that?
Her name is Julie Bentz, Bentz.
Okay. My understanding is the ASPs need 3 times the helium-3 as the PVTs?
That the way it was designed was to have even more sensitivity for neutrons than the PVT systems did, but so we put more helium-3 tubes in the ASP design. But if we wanted to maintain the same level of sensitivity as the PVT for neutrons, it would require the same amount of helium-3. There's nothing that links the neutron detection technology to whether it's an ASP or a PVT.
So as it's currently designed?
It was designed to have more sensitivity to neutrons than the PVT system, because more sensitivity is better.
So how much more helium-3 is being utilized in an ASP than a PVT?
About 3 times.
About 3 times. So.
But what I'm saying is, though, that's if we want to go back to the same level of sensitivity as we currently have with the PVT, then the amount of helium-3 that would be required for an ASP unit would be the same as for a PVT unit.
Well, then why would we have to change the unit if the sensitivity wasn't increased?
Because this is for neutron detection only.
Okay.
There's another part of the system that detects gamma rays, and that's the part that's different. So maybe I should say that so the difference between an ASP and a PVT is the gamma ray detection part. In one case, for the PVT, it's a big block of plastic, and in the case of an ASP, it's chunks of sodium iodide. But in both cases, the neutron detection part is done with tubes of helium-3 gas, and that part is essentially the same with both systems.
So you could redesign it so it would use the same amount of helium-3 and not really jeopardize the security?
Right. You wouldn't even have to redesign it. You could just take the tubes out. Cut the number of tubes down by pulling them out.
Okay.
It'd be simple to do that.
Okay. That answers my question. Thank you. I yield back.
Thank you. Well, I thought we had there was a Steve Rothman sighting, but that was perhaps a false positive. I think we've now had sufficient questions for now, at least. We may have an additional hearing on this. You know, we do have, all members have top secret clearance. We have, in this building and in the Cannon building, we have rooms with leaded walls, and members go in and have to drop off their BlackBerries and their cell phones before they go in, and they bring down a cone of silence, and we hear all the top secret stuff. And if we need to do that, we will. But if we go through that exercise and don't hear anything, it's going to be pretty irritating. So let's not do that right away. But before we close the hearing out, Dr. Hagan, can you tell us exactly where you think we'll be on April 1? Will we have completed successful field tests? Will there be a cost-benefit analysis? Where will we be on April 1? 3 years ago, the then head of your unit said, let's get this stuff deployed right now. Where will we be in April?
I can, because of the helium-3 issue, I just cannot give you an answer about the cost-benefit analysis. We know how important it is, and we may be able to do something, but without knowing how much the helium-3 or the neutron detection part of the system will cost, it makes that difficult. But we're looking at ways to try to get around that. Going back to field validation, well, maybe I should let Mr. Owen respond about the schedule, but by April, we'll be, I suspect, in some phase of field validation or operational test.
Mr. Owen?
In terms of the field validation, we have those 2 critical errors that we've been discussing. We feel those have been addressed by DNDO. There's a few other minor issues that we're working through. Our objective is to restart field validation in the first quarter of calendar year 2010. So within the next few months, we should restart field validation for a 3rd round and go forward from there.
Okay. All right. Before we bring this hearing to a close, I want to thank our witnesses for testifying. And I guess it's a little early to say I look forward to seeing you the next time. Under the rules of the committee, the record will remain open for 2 weeks for additional statements from the members and for any answers to any follow-up questions the committee may have for the witnesses. The witnesses are excused and the hearing is now adjourned.